12 years, which feels like no time and then feels like all the time. But
yeah, that's so interesting. Web developer, SEO, community. I'm sure people out there have like a more linear line, but I love that. Right. Katie, you want to go next?
Sure. So my story is a little different. I was working right out of college. I got my degree in international relations, which I've found actually a lot of people in the community space tend to have that kind of a background. I don't know why. I think diplomacy, it's a very useful skill to have in this career. But anyway, so I was working at a very small startup, and I basically had a boss come to me one day and be like, guess what? You're going to be a community manager. And I said, what's that? And he goes, it's all these things. It's events, it's recruiting, it's this, it's that, it's all this stuff. And I was like, well, what if I don't want to do that? And then he goes, well, then you can find another job. So I decided to figure it out. That is effectively how I got started on my career path, but it actually was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. I love what I do, and I love the work that we do. So now I'm here. Cindy, how about you?
Threatened in community. That's not what I thought was, but good to know. Another path into the community world.
Yeah, so I also, had basically a whole other career prior to community. I was an academic. I got my PhD in English literature. I had a vision of becoming a professor at some point, but finished the degree and realized that I didn't want to do that. So I ended up working in tech, mostly just throwing my resume at like hundreds of companies in New York and hoping desperately that anyone would hire me. And a little company called Kickstarter at the time ended up calling me back. And I ended up becoming one of their very early employees in a community role, which, somewhat similar to Katie's experience, was just like a grab bag of everything. But over time, we built community into a real team, into an organization, and into a function that, I think ultimately was kind of what launched my career in community since. And so, I've worked with a lot of other startups, and I'm at Brainly now, obviously, and it's been a wonderful journey and one that I didn't plan, but I'm very happy that I ended up here. So
fabulous. And Shayna?
Yeah, I'm kind of on a gen path where I was originally started off as a music therapist. And while I was getting my master's degree, I ended up volunteering for my first community manager job, which was at Her. And it was so unexpected how the slippery slope of everything went through. From I was volunteering to write blogs, I was helping them host events on their platform, I started doing their social media. Then they were like, hey, come and like revamp all of our social media for us. And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? Like, I have some time. This is great pocket money for me on the side. I went and did it. Didn't realize that it was a test. And then they offered a full-time job for me to jump into the community space, and I've continued ever since and haven't looked back. So it's definitely been a journey, but worthwhile. And I appreciate the amount of psychology and people management and having to engage with different backgrounds that has been able to afford me to be a solid community manager today.
Thank you. So interesting. I'd love to hear from the audience. So if you're out there, let us know in the chat box, how did you get started on your career path in community? All right, so I want to address this question to Cindy. Cindy, you are in a director level role here, and I'd love to know, what does leadership mean to you? Because we're focusing this panel on community and leadership. So what does leadership mean to you, and what is your leadership style?
Yeah, so I thought quite a bit about this question, actually, knowing the topic of our conversation today. And perhaps maybe unsurprisingly, I think about community and leadership as being very parallel, right? What it takes to be a great community leader is also just the strengths that you want to be available in leadership in general. And ultimately, I think it's about creating trust at scale. And that's what makes it both really, really challenging, but also so rewarding. Because when you're able to create a culture that has that trust, where you really, really imbue individuals inside of your, whether it's your community, your organization, your team, with the ability to sort of be aligned around a clear vision, a clear mission, clear goals, but really trust them to participate in that and to know what impact they can have. I think that's where leadership really pays off, and you start to see the results of like the time, the hard work, the effort that you put into creating that culture. So when it comes to leadership style, I'm absolutely a community builder at heart. I think of my teams and my organization as itself a community. I think of our company as a community. And I think of all of our users as potentially part of that community. So if we can build alignment across all of those areas, then that to me is where your business really starts to sing, where you start to see that not only do you have a place where all the customers are happy, but your business is growing, your team is growing. And that's what I, strive for. And it's a constant, like you never really, you're never really done, I guess. But that's what I'm always working towards.
Love that. Very hashtagable there. Trust. Oh, shoot, I just lost it. Trust at scale. Yes. Love it there. Love it. So I'm going to direct this question to Katie and Shayna. No path is without its tough decisions. So what are some of the toughest career decisions that you've had to make, and how did it impact your journey to where you are today?
Shayna, do you want to go first?
I was like, yeah, she jumped off mic. She can go first. Got
we
you.
can popcorn back and forth.
Yeah, I think most recently for myself, I think even just making the decision to leave my first role at Her was one of the most difficult ones. And I definitely took months to think about it. You've come in and launched a whole space, built out different systems in it. You know people by name and face and where they're from and all of their stories. And you just never want to leave that. That's become your own mini family as a community manager. But understanding that if something for you doesn't line up in your professional development, then you have to make that decision for yourself. And you have to hope that the systems that you have put in place are going to be able to carry over. Like that's a mark of a really great community manager, is knowing that the systems that you have put in place can last without you being there 24/7 or engaging in the community. You're like, I've set this up so that you can just run and I'll just be here to update it and fix it and help you as the community develops. And I think that was one of the hardest decisions. And then getting to another place and recognizing that that was also not a fit for me. And it didn't mean that it was failure. That just meant that this was not going to line up with what I was after. And again, the professional development that I needed to do. And so thankfully I've landed at a space where I feel like that development is going to flourish and that I'll be supported and I'm in the space that I need. But when people talk about those questions of, do you want to be in a startup space, or do you want to be on a team? Do you want to be solo? Do you want to be launching new things? Those are very important questions to be able to answer. And I definitely had to reevaluate throughout. And it's okay to change your mind. That's totally welcome. So those were some of my personal challenges. Katie, what about you?
That I'm so glad you said that. You totally took the words out of my mouth. So yeah, always knowing when to leave a job has always been the hardest, because as community builders, we put so much of our heart and soul into everything that we do. And so it feels almost, traumatic might be a little too insensible word to use, but it really is a big, heavy decision to make, to step away from something that you've built. And so for me, yeah, one of the toughest decisions I ever made was making the decision to leave Square. It was just time for me, and it was time for me to go do something different with my career. It was time for the team that I had put in place to step up, and they've done a really great job. And that's probably been one of the best things about leaving, is looking back and seeing how well that the team is doing. And it just kind of underscores that you've made the right decisions and that you're doing the right thing. But one other challenge that I wanted to bring up for everyone that you start to run into as you get higher up in your career and you have teams, one of the other toughest decisions is knowing when you have to reorganize, right? Reorgs are rough, and they are rough on you as a leader. They are rough on your team. I actually sometimes jokingly will be like, I wonder how much money a company loses every time they decide to reorg, because of how much, there's just so much emotional overhead that goes into it. So almost just as tough as knowing when to leave a job is knowing when to reorg, but reorgs are necessary. It's really important to make sure that you have the right people in the right place so that they're ultimately doing the best that they can do, right? Like as a lead, your job is really to make sure that your people can fly, right? You really want to unblock them to make sure that they are doing their best work. And so sometimes if you're not reporting into the right people, or if the structure is just, some teams aren't in the same group and they should be, and vice versa, then you have to make those tough decisions. But yeah, I think leaving and reorgs are probably two of the toughest decisions I've ever made in my career.
And how did that reorg impact where you are in your journey?
Usually I use gardening as an analogy all the time when I'm talking about my career and community, but it's kind of like when you're pruning a tree back or something. When you prune something, it comes back and grows bigger. And I've noticed that in my career, generally speaking, as much as maybe I might not have been on board at the start, or it was a really hard decision, it usually makes way for new growth. And then you see the team, once you move past that initial kind of like storming phase of like figuring out how to work with each other and how to work within a new construct, then usually you see more growth, better results, better collaboration, that sort of thing.
Lovely. Thanks for sharing. And those tuning in, let us know, what are some of the toughest career decisions that you have had to make? Tough decisions are part of the career path, but also challenges. We're going to always face those. So this is for Jen and Cindy. You both are in director level roles. What challenges did you incur on your path to the executive level? And how did you persevere through these challenges? Maybe Jen, you want to go first?
Yeah. So for me, I think one of the hardest things is like, there is no specific path, right? If you go down the marketing path or a developer path, or, there's lots of other career paths. There's a distinct, you take a step, what the next step is. And my first job was, a sole community manager. And then I needed to add another person. And it was like, oh, so what does that make me? But I'm still managing. And anyway, so to me, the biggest thing is that there isn't a path. There isn't a clear path. David Spinks actually recently tweeted this is the community career path. And I replied and was like, actually, it's more like, and I put it's this and then this, and you get this role, and then you move back and down and up and over. And it's a lot of, there's not a really clear path. I think part of that also comes from the fact that community doesn't have a clear place, right? It depends on the organization. Is it in marketing? Is it in product? Is it in support? Is it its own separate thing? And so I think a lot of those really play into sort of what those issues are, or play into the problems that you sort of encounter going down that path. For me, I've just kind of barreled through, make my way, I think we've all had to do that, right? You get put in this role of okay, Katie's figure out community. And you're like, okay, well, I need my job, so I'm going to figure this out. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh my gosh, I love this. And then you go to your first CMX and you're like, these are my people. And you start to just sort of inch your way forward. For me, the biggest thing right now is helping my team and other people around me who are new or trying to figure out what that path looks like, is helping them to understand, to make it easier for them to know what the next step is and how to grow in their career and how to make community their career path. Yeah.
Yeah, no, because the playbook really hasn't been written, or it's just being written now. So Cindy, I'd love to hear again your challenges on your path to the executive level.
Yeah, I would echo obviously so many of the things that Jen just mentioned as well, where it's really hard to chart a course when there's not a lot of precedent. And certainly, when I was at Kickstarter, that was, this very accelerated path, I would say, from, just being someone who's working as a community manager and working on community support, and then growing into a director VP. And that wasn't an obvious thing that was definitely going to happen. It was absolutely as a result of the needs of the company growing, and suddenly sort of recognizing that so much of our growth was being driven by community. It didn't make sense for there not to be sort of a person representing that at the executive level. And so I think, it was hard. It wasn't obvious. It's not like someone invited me and said, "Hey, Cindy, do you want to be VP?" Not at all. It was, "Hey, every week this executive team meets to talk about company strategy, and community is a part of that conversation in terms of what's being discussed. But community, as far as the team goes, was not represented." And so that was a gap that I saw, and I, was trying to be patient and do a good job, and thinking like, "Oh, that's a bummer. Really, we should be there." And then over the course of, several months, realizing that this was actually becoming an impedance to our progress as an organization. And I was like, you know what? It's important that we bring community into this strategic area, because it means that we're going to be better off as a company. It means that my colleagues don't have to try to represent on my behalf what needs to be done. And it really just took, support from my mentor, who was our VP of operations at the time, my coach kind of helping me, feel comfortable making the request and making clear the why. And then ultimately our management team recognizing, yes, this makes sense, and we're going to take a chance on you because you've proven that you can do this over the course of 3.5 years. And so that was, an important moment, but one of those things that, like, in the moment, I mostly was just relieved that we would be able to do our jobs really well. I wasn't actually celebrating the, like, oh, damn, I'm like a VP of community here. But that's, that's kind of the thing about when you're in it, you're just thinking about, oh my God, how do I make sure that my people have what they need? How do I make sure our community has what it needs? And I do think that, in our space, that is our focus. We're thinking about other people. And so when you think about charting that path to exec, it's complicated, because it does look different in every organization. And it's ultimately, is it what you want? And is it what's right for the company? And making the case on those two fronts, I think, is going to be the best, kind of general approach. But it's definitely different everywhere you go, and it's never quite straightforward.
Thanks for sharing. And for those viewing, I'm sure you're having lots of questions coming in your mind. Please drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll take those at the end of the session here. Katie, this question's for you. So we have had a long year. We were just talking about that before we started this. It's been a very odd year for everyone out there. I'd love to know, what's the most important community business discovery you've made in the past year during COVID?
I thought a lot about this question, and I still don't know that I necessarily have the best answer. But really, I think what I've learned most during COVID as it relates to community is just how important community builders are. Everyone needs community, no matter what. And it can be as simple as, saying hi to the person that you see every day in your corner bodega, or it could be, as big as, working in the scaled community orgs that a lot of us work in. But I think that's just really what comes down to me more than ever, is that when the entire world stops, when we all are effectively told to stay in place wherever you are, whether you are partnered with someone or if you have roommates or if you're living alone, is the moment that the world stops, you really recognize that connection is more important than ever before. And connection is what helped, I think, to pull all of us through some of the really, really challenging moments. And we're still in a really challenging time, right? Like there is some light at the end of the tunnel, but we're not there yet. And so I have to relate all that back to business as well. And what Cindy and Jen said earlier about, thinking as your team as a community, thinking of your company as a community, the same principles apply, and having more empathy, and really just, I think everyone now, it's easier for people to pick up on the value of connection and the value of building those relationships. But it just really, to me, the last year has highlighted the importance of our work and of our industry and everything that we're here to do. So
definitely.
I don't know if anyone else would jump in on that.
Yeah.
I just have a quick thing. We've seen how many jobs are coming through in the community space. Like, what? Right? I mean, every day in the Slack channel, Valentina puts, I feel like every week there's what, 10, 15 new jobs. It's amazing. So I think that the forced digital transformation has also forced people to realize that, like, oh, community is a thing, and we need somebody to run this, right?
Definitely. Yeah, there's real value behind it. The whole world was leaning on community this past year. And so businesses really recognize the value that they can provide and also bring for themselves as a business when they really put resources and people into community. Shayna, I want to address this to you because you had mentioned also, starting, I believe, was it with her that you were like volunteering to step up to write blog posts and to do different things? How, for women who want to advance up the career ladder in community, what skills do you recommend that they hone?
I would say my favorite skill to hone in on is your networking skill. I would not have gotten half of the place. A bunch of community managers and people just in the space of what I was working on, from social media to events, all the way up to community, did not take the time to get on a call with me to talk me through what I was doing, tell me the resources that I needed to look at, understand what systems were at play and what I had to work against. I don't think I would have made that possible. And I'm always telling people that, like, my favorite networking ability is just to drop in people's DMs and message them for anything and everything, but come in with a purpose as well. Not just like, hey, I saw that you did this, I'd love to get on a call, and then come not providing any value. Where you want to come in with questions, you want to make that 30 minutes or hour valuable and absolutely be able to take something tangible from that. I think we always do those actionable steps, and you want to be able to have those after a call. Also doing that internally, working with your team and just going and picking that person that is going to be your resource on your team. I had no idea what I was doing with engineering or UX UI design. I had to go and talk to my teammate to say, hey, I have this idea. How can we absolutely go from this area all the way over to this other area? I have this idea. How can I actually put this in place? Is this real? Am I just making up something and we can't put it in place? I need to know, and I need to have those people that are fine with me messaging them regularly and say, hey, what does this look like? Also start to become best friends with your data person. If you're coming in new and starting to have to do that, you need to learn what numbers are available that you can track so that you can show it to higher ups. They just want to see the numbers, really. It's very frustrating at times because you're like, but the people, they want to see what the people are doing. They want to see the numbers behind the people. You need to know at least enough to be able to share your story so you can get that buy-in with executives, and work on your presentation skills as well. I think my presentation skills have definitely evolved over time, and understanding pitching in a way for new programming, for anything that you want to build out, your pitching. And as much as we're like, we want to do it for the people, it's like, I can talk to another community manager. We can understand that we want to do great stuff for people, but you're talking to somebody who's like, but I need to raise money for this company so that we can continue to grow. It's like, you have to pitch. And that's been something that I've had to come out of my comfort zone to do, where I'm like, I have to sell this to you. And that's really stressful, but it's very, very helpful skill to be able to do, and something I still continue to work on. So you definitely want to have that in place as well.
Fabulous tips. And what have you done to hone that skill of presenting?
More networking and saying, hey, will you listen to my presentation? What am I missing? Does this make sense? Does this sound good? I go and ask some of the questions that are then asked to me and say, like, I'm explaining it in this way. Is there a way that I can do this better? And especially in like the Slack groups for like CMX or for Comps or the community club, and just dropping in there and saying, hey, if I say this, does this make sense? Do you understand it? Because if a community person doesn't understand it, then nobody else is going to understand it. So kind of pulse checking. And same thing with anybody who's been at your company maybe longer and they've had to do these presentations, and you can go and say, hey, I'm doing this presentation about X topic. How does this sound? Can you please give me tips and tricks? I've watched a few of like the negotiating pitch masterclasses. Go and watch a pitching competition and see what important steps those people do, because it's incredible having to figure out like an elevator pitch and build your way up from that so that you have a full-on presentation. Take those times to just watch those and see the strategies that they're doing, and go from there.
Fabulous tips. Thank you. And I'm curious out there, for those that are watching in the chat, let us know how network has helped you advance in community. Were you able to get a job from that, or just internally networking? Like Shayna said, were you able to get yourself a promotion? Let us know. Curious to hear. Jen, this question is for you. So we're talking about women in leadership today. What are some of the struggles of being a woman in leadership? And the second part of that, piggyback on that question, is if you had to start from scratch, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?
So some of the struggles. Well, first of all, I think we could talk for the whole time about some of the struggles that we may encounter in this, right? Like some of it has to do with the not having a clear path, right? Some of it has to do, there's a great TED Talk, and I wish that I would have looked at and found it earlier. It's a great TED Talk by this woman talking about how men are trained and from the get-go on how to talk about money and how to move up and what it takes to get into these higher positions. I had a conversation, I want to say 6 years ago or something, with my boss, where she said, you need to have these skills to move up to a senior director or whatever. And I was like, why didn't anybody tell me that? Nobody ever told me I had to know, that I had to care about money. I mean, yes, well, I was a web developer before, and I didn't care about the money side of things, right? There's just a lot of things like that we are not, I guess, primed for. We're not told from the beginning, oh, by the way, if you want to continue to move up, you need to learn this and know this and, have these different skills. When it comes to what I would do differently, I think there are two things. One is, probably anybody who's met me, or specifically who works with me, knows that I will stand up for myself. But I would say that I would stand up for myself even more with microaggressions and things that we often laugh off, right? Somebody says something and you're like, oh, that's funny. Like, yeah, I won't go into specifics. We all know. So I would take a stand against that right away, not only at the company, but within the community, right? Making sure that those things, it's not okay in any sense. The other, and I think this goes back to sort of what some of those issues are, is I would find a mentor, and specifically a sponsor, much sooner. If I would have known, number one, that a sponsor is a thing. And for those of you who may not know, a mentor is there to learn from, to help guide you, even a career coach. But a sponsor is somebody within the organization who's already in a leadership role, who is looking to help you move up, who is thinking about you and, trying to get you there. Men do this really well. They've always done this, like they bring their friends up. They're always lifting each other up. So it's something for me as a woman that I push hard, within my teams as well, is I'm constantly looking at the women on the team and even outside of the team. And, if there are ways that I can help and lift them up and guide them and sort of be that sponsor, it's an important thing. But I would have sought that out along, much, much sooner.
Mm-hmm. Totally, right? You live and you learn, but these are great gems of wisdom here that people can start implementing. And I just want to mention, I'm seeing questions coming in. If you guys can drop those in the Q&A box, we will get to those at the end of our session here. So I think a few of you have mentioned, talking to community people, we get it. But when you have to talk to other orgs and teams, you really have to advocate. But in terms of how does a community executive work with upper VPs and CEOs to advocate for their communities and teams? I'd love to hear from everybody. How do you do that? How do you get buy-in and advocate for what you're doing?
I can jump in.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, you popcorn didn't. No, you did the last time.
No. So you want me to go or you go? Okay. Okay. So my little tip here was actually kind of coming off of some of Shayna's advice around pitching earlier, which is really like learn to speak the language of your company. Figure out if like your company, are you an email heavy company? Are you a Slack heavy company? Like all the other different ways that people can communicate with each other, figure out how to speak the language, and then also figure out how to speak the language of your execs and your VPs. And it usually is related to data. So making friends with a data scientist, ask those questions. I love sitting down with data scientists and saying, so I have this question, if I wanted to measure XYZ, how would I do that? Right? I think there is this misconception for most of my early community career, which was that I needed to know everything. I needed to be like an Excel wizard and a data scientist and a programmer. Like I had to be able to do all of these things. And the reality is that's not the truth. You just have to know the right people to ask. So I would talk to your, I would watch really closely at how your execs and people communicate with you. Look at the words they use. Are there specific taglines that are really popular around your company right now? Like maybe everybody's rallying around like a particular goal. Make sure that the work that you're doing ladders back into that, and then get your numbers and report it. And my last piece of advice before I jump off of this soapbox is you are going to get so sick and tired of hearing yourself tell your story before anyone else will. So if you feel like, oh my gosh, I've said this so many times, 3 times, who cares? Keep telling your story, because nobody else is going to pick up on that for much, much longer. Shayna or someone else.
Yeah, I'm going to +1 to just about everything that you said. I do a lot of talking to people who do those presentations regularly. Like, what are the questions that you want answered? And if I do have the opportunity to talk to any of my VPs or CEOs, I will directly ask them. I think I just did this last week with our VP of marketing. I said, what do you need to hear from me so that it's not coming in and my message or my story is not getting lost? What can I connect this to for you? And jumping onto each team to say, if you're going to collaborate with another team, see what numbers they're impacting so that you can say, cool, my action here is going to also impact this part of the company and this other team and this other team. And that's already growing the added value that you need. I think just like Katie, I'm in that part where I am basically taking myself on a mini roadshow through the company and telling them my ideas. And I'm like, cool, I'm thinking of this space. How can what I'm doing help you? Here's my idea. And then they start to spiral. And when I start to see people get that, like, looks like the wheels are turning in their head, that's when I know I'm onto something, because then they show me other spaces that I didn't even know existed and how my initiatives can tie into what they're doing. And that can be put into my presentation and say, how I do this initiative is going to now impact this other team. And so being able to show that business value within your space, even if you haven't launched yet. I haven't launched my space. I'm getting buy-in of like, this is what this space can potentially look like if you give me the go ahead to do it. And that's one of the best ways that I've been able to get anything pushed forward. So that's me. I'll push it to Cindy.
I mean, definitely +1,000 to everything that Katie and Shanna shared already as well. I think the one added thing I would put here is, in addition to obviously being that consummate, dedicated storyteller of community to your execs and to your VPs, there's a little bit of extra work we have to put in because our discipline is not well understood, which is that we have to educate everyone across the company about what community is. What are the different levers that we have to draw from? So it's not just about headcount and automation and technology, it's also about community members, and that actually being a strategic benefit an advantage that you've invested in. And so showing what the impact of that investment can be with the data ultimately can be really, really powerful, but it does constantly kind of require this education, reminding what this is, how it's different from other areas, and getting sort of, more feedback on that as well, because it does look different depending on what kind of company you work in. So I think that can be a really powerful companion to the storytelling as well.
I'm just going to add, beat that drum. The thing is consistency and talking about it, and always, when the question comes up, that you have the same answer, or that you're constantly, I think having it always there. I tell my team this all the time too, and it feels sometimes like we're always talking about ourselves. Like, yes, well, it took us 6 months of beating the drum for people to realize, oh yes, we have user groups. We need to send our customers to them, right? It was like, we had to constantly beat the drum and make it a thing and turn it into it. But what also happens with that, the great thing is when you no longer have to beat the drum, because you start seeing other people in other teams saying the things. And that's when I'm like, okay, I did my job there, because now all these other people are talking about it, and we can jump in and do our work.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I'm seeing all the comments come in. People are loving this. All right, going to keep it moving here. So as we all know, working in the community industry, our work is never done. We could work 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, but we don't. But some companies push you to do that. So for Cindy and Shayna, do you have any suggestions for how to change a company's culture of overextending community professionals? Like, where do we start with trying to change a culture?
Yeah, that is a really, really challenging one, because I think, companies want community, but it does take time to build that properly and in a healthy way inside of an organization. And I think the best thing you can do is, whether you're trying to do all the things and you don't have someone advocating for you, or if you do have a manager advocating for you, is to really point out that all the things is not a strategy. It is not a job, right? That's just a place to put things until you kind of figure out what you want to do with it. And so, the challenge of the all the things job means that if you burn out and you leave, all the things are gone. And that's a really, really hard thing to recover from. And often that also means part of your community might even leave with that person. And so I think giving the role the respect it deserves by actually carving out, what does this look like in reality when we map out the work to be done, the impact that it can have, and what are the roles required to actually do all of that work? And usually it means one job is actually 3. And that's a tough pitch, because it means we're going to have to add resources. But it's an important one, because on the other side of it, if you make that investment, those sort of 3 people can suddenly have an impact that's tenfold instead of 1 who's going to get really, really burnt out. So, again, I empathize, because I think pretty much all of us who started, especially as, a solo community manager working at a startup without a lot of resources, have experienced the immense difficulty of trying to have that conversation and trying to figure out how to get someone to agree to turn your 1 job into 3 or 2 even. But again, I think at the end of the day, if your company respects the work, respects the domain, and respects you, that can be a path that can be created. And if not, then that's a different probably decision that has to be made, which is this the right place for you to grow? So.
Thank you.
Is this the right place for you to grow is the question, especially when it does become what Cindy said. It's like the job is not a catch-all, all the things. When I left one of my jobs, they turned my role into 4 other people's roles. And I was like, look, I was doing all of this. And now that I've left, you had to figure out how that was going to work. And came back and like candidly had that discussion with my boss. Like, thankfully, she was awesome. And I was able to showed like, look at all the initiatives that you're now able to do because you have X amount of people. So I would also state pushing and advocating for yourself and your time is a huge thing. I know for a lot of people that's very intimidating, or we're in toxic workplaces that make it like question whether or not you're able to handle that. And especially as a woman, and for my intersectional identities of being Black, queer, and a woman, like the only thing I want to do is show how badass I am and how much I can do. But I also have to sit and say, I can't do everything though. Like I would need assistance here, or we have to knock this initiative off so I can focus here because this one is giving us the return that we need. And knowing that if you say that and your leadership or your workplace does not respect that, then you know what your decision is. You know that it's like, well, you just made this very easy for me. I came to you and laid this out plain and clear. And if you're not going to respect that, then this is not my space. And I think having that self-awareness, like it's a tough conversation. Like Katie and I were talking about, like one of the hardest things to do is to choose to leave a role. And I got to do that very quickly in the last like few-ish months and establish kind of what those boundaries were for myself. So figuring out your workplace boundaries, being clear and consistent in your communication, as Jen said, and understanding what can get done and what needs to be put on hold. But yeah, workplace boundaries are a very real thing to put in place.
Thank you, ladies. All right, I got another question here because today is International Women's Day. And so this is for Katie and Jen. Is there a particular woman leader that you look up to or model yourself after? And then is there a book or resource you'd recommend?
I'll jump in here. So I'll do both right away. I definitely look up to, well, there are many women. But I recently started listening to Michelle Obama's podcast. She's obviously an incredible leader. But in her podcast, she has, there's one particular one that really stood out where she's talking with her mentees. So it's these young women that she's mentored. I was in tears listening to it, not because it was just, I was just like that. She is the kind of leader and the kind of mentor that I want to be. I want to have these conversations in several years with the women on my team, or people out in the community industry, to know that I have helped them in their career and move up and move on and that sort of thing. And that particular one really stood out to me. I mean, obviously, she's amazing in many ways, but that one really affected me, and I would highly encourage anyone to listen to her podcast. Obviously, she has a book and all kinds of things, but the podcast is really got me.
I'm going to have to listen to that episode. I haven't heard that one yet. And I'll bring a box of tissues with me. I think I took this question in a little bit of a different direction, and that I try to look for inspiration in bits and pieces wherever I can. So it might be like a podcast over here, or an article over there. I think one of my favorite articles that I've ever read, less about community, more specifically about women in particular, is from Ellen Petrie-Lenz. And I think the title of the article is called Just Say No. And it talks about how our language and the kind of filler words that we tend to use can actually weaken what we're saying. So things like that. But really, when I think of resources and people, there's just so much goodness out there. And I think just starting to find one person, one thing to ask questions to, and then asking people who else you should know, and who else you should know of, is how I've come across some really interesting leaders. I like aspects of Glennon Doyle's book, Untamed. So there's definitely some good chapters in there about leadership that I would recommend. And I also think too, especially when it comes down to resources, investing in yourself is really important. I can't tell you how much I have taken from personal therapy sessions, or frankly, even couples therapy with my ex. So much of the couples therapy work has come back into the workplace for me, because it's all about communication, right? And so if you have the resources and the means, and there's, I think there's a lot of, I feel like technology is helping to make therapy in particular a lot more accessible to people through things like Mental Happy, BetterUp, stuff like that. But yeah, working on yourself is probably one of like the best resources that I can recommend, because if you're not whole, you can't be whole to anyone, whether it's your team or your community. So that's where I took that one.
Fabulous. Thank you. And for those listening, let us know, what women leaders do you look up to and what resources can you share and recommend? I have one more question to ask here before we jump into the Q&A. So if you have any questions, drop them in the Q&A box. But this question, last question, is for everybody. What bite-sized advice would you give to women who want to be leaders of a community team? Who wants to go? Bite-sized advice.
Bite-sized advice is to know that you can do it and take the steps to go for it. You're a badass in your own right, and there's nothing else that's holding you back.
I would add to that you don't have to do it by yourself. It's it's important to kind of bring your crew with you, figure out who your collaborators and advocates are, and let them be your support as you're making your path forward. So don't do it alone, because you don't have to.
I lean on your strengths. That's anyone who has ever worked with me ever is like that. That's my beating of the drum, is to lean on your strengths. You can get super awesome at your strengths, and you may only be mediocre at the things that you're horrible at, like project management. Hi. And so lean into your strengths and know that there are people around you who have other strengths who complement you.
I think my last bit of advice is that the next time anyone tells you that you are aggressive or abrasive or bitchy or icy, I've had all four of those things said to me in one-on-one feedback sessions with men. Smile and say thank you and just move on. Like, we all show up and work really, really hard every day. And there's absolutely this double standard that gets carried around what you can say and what you can't say. And if you don't use that exclamation point or the smiley face, then heaven forbid you're in a mood. Or if you're not on camera, right? Or if you're not smiling, or if your tone of voice isn't at a particular level, there are all these things we get judged on that frankly men don't. So I say own it. And yeah, there's always a way, and you always have to be thoughtful about how you're collaborating. But for the most part, I've rarely found that type of feedback to be actually supportive and actionable. So just know that it means you're doing something right if you're getting that feedback.
Fabulous. Thank you, ladies. All right, we're going to hop into Q&A, but just a little round of applause for that incredible panel. Thank you, ladies, so much. We have about 3 minutes for Q&A, so I'm just going to jump in here and try to get through as many questions as I can. First question here is from Piper. She says, how do you stand up against microaggressions without seeming aggressive yourself? Whoever wants to chime in, just go for it.
I don't know that you won't necessarily be called aggressive for saying it, but I have gotten to the point in my career that I call it out, and I say, like, it's not okay to do that. Although I've also recently, in the past year, had a few things that it took me a while before I said something, and I, smacked my head about it. Like, you gotta stand up and push back and say, like, it's not okay. That that's not whatever.
Yeah, I would agree with Jen. If you can find the kind of courage within to say something, please do, and know that you have like an entire worldwide network of women who are standing behind you. I recognize that it can be really hard and scary sometimes, and so like when I get to the point where I have to say something that I'm nervous to say, I'll often say something like, listen, I don't have the right words to say this, so it might sound a little funny, but here's how I'm feeling. And so just by like giving that little bit of an intro, you almost buy yourself a little bit of grace to then say kind of like whatever it is you need to. But yeah, I think if you're going to push back on a microaggression, I would not worry about coming off as aggressive.
All right. Next question, thank you. Next question, how do you ask someone to be your sponsor? And is it best to ask someone within your department or in another one?
That is a really great question. I don't know that it necessarily has to be in your department. Also, if you're in community, you're probably going to move departments multiple times. So, you know, like finding someone who that you can connect with, that sees your value, that sees the work that you've done and knows that it's a, you know, something of importance, doesn't necessarily have to be in your direct leadership, right? Could be somebody, maybe it's somebody on the executive team in a totally different department, and they're, you know, essentially speaking up for you and your work on those leadership calls.
Fabulous. That was
and asking, I mean, I think that's a hard one, but I think just reaching out, somebody is going to feel pretty good and pretty happy to be asked to be in that role.
Got it. All right. I'm going to ask one more question. Anne-Marie, I know you're out there, so this is going to be the last one. And then if you want to hop back on. This is from Melanie. This one got a few upvotes. So I want to ask, she says, I've been building an entire community program for several years, but my title and pay haven't been keeping up with my work and shown impact at my organization. I need to position myself a bit to get that next big job. Any good suggestions for positioning when you have a bunch of good experiences and clear success, but not a title that matches?
One of my favorite things to do is make sure, and if anybody has seen me speak before, I always talk about having those receipts of the things that you have done, and just keep a running tab of the initiatives that you have done to say, like, this is what I've done and this was the results. And it doesn't have to be a full paragraph of written out things. Keep it quick so that they can look at it and say, like, this is what I've done. This is how it delivered. This is what else I've done. This is how it delivered. I did this in this span of time, which means that I'm over delivering in comparison to your job description, especially if you're doing things outside of your job description. That is another thing that you can point out and say, like, this is what I have done. This is outside of my scope. If you want me to continue doing these initiatives, then you need to pay me and give me the title on that level of things. And I've done it before where I've also compared to other people's roles that I know of, that I'm like, hey, I had my friend Angie Coleman, who at the time worked at Lesbians Who Tech, and we were kind of parallel in that. And I was like, I'm doing all of this, yet Angie does these similar things, and this is her title, and this is what she's doing. And sometimes you just have to put it into something where it's like a similar space that you're in to get that. And I end up getting the promotion that I asked for. So that's one suggestion that I have.
I would also add, depending on the company you work at, smaller companies less likely to have this, but larger companies will often have like a compensation philosophy. So we're talking about levels and job profiles and pay bands and all that sort of stuff. Get familiar with that. Ask your HR business partner if your company, again, is large enough to have one. But ask them, what is our compensation philosophy? Help me understand. I want to get my career to the next level. Like, what can you help give me? And on the flip side, when you're interviewing, also a great question to ask those recruiters. What is your comp philosophy? How do you pay people? You want to hear them say things like, oh, we use kind of like the Radford structure, or how you can ask them, how do you do your market analysis, right? Community, as we've talked about, is a job that means something different in every company. Job titles in particular mean different things in every company. Some companies specifically do not use the title senior director because they don't want that hierarchy, even if you're doing a senior director job. And so just asking those questions and getting clarity on that before you go into a role or when you're in a role can often help you to make the case, because you understand sort of like the parameters that you have to work within.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, ladies. I'm going to hand it to Anne-Marie, but everyone out there watching, give us a virtual round of applause for this fabulous panel of women. Shayna, Cindy, Katie, Jen, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for all the wisdom you shared today.
Yes, definitely an ovation. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. Definitely pulled out some major key insights, especially for our CMX Master classes, right? We've got storytelling, data delivery, communicating with execs. Like, let's get this on. Let's get the education out there for everyone who needs it in order to move up the ladder. And let's just, make ourselves better all around. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Again, this is recorded and will be up live shortly. And I hope you all have a great day. Happy International Women's Day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.